The words on the blackboard were not a lesson. They were a farewell. Daniel Walker first saw them in the spring of 2015, on a Tuesday afternoon thick with the scent of dust and decay. He was in his late grandmother's house, a small Creole cottage on the outskirts of Beau Reve, Louisiana, tasked with the slow, somber duty of sorting through a life's possessions. In a heavy cedar chest, beneath a false bottom he found by accident, was a rusted tin box. Inside, nestled between a rosary and locks of baby hair, lay a single photograph. It was a class picture, sepia-toned and cracked with age, the faces of 24 young women staring out from a forgotten past. In the corner, a faded ink inscription read simply, Louisiana, 1912. The image itself was a relic, a piece of anonymous history, until Daniel's gaze drifted to the chalkboard behind the girls, and the silent message written there changed everything. His initial interest was that of an architect, a man trained to see the stories held within old structures and forgotten objects. He studied the stiff collars of the girls' dresses, the severe partings in their hair, the stern-faced nun standing watch at the edge of the frame. It was a portrait of discipline and conformity from another century. Then, his eyes settled on one girl in the second row. She was younger than the others, perhaps 17, with large, dark eyes that held a profound and familiar melancholy. He recognized them instantly. They were his sister's eyes. They were Clara's eyes. He knew this must be Grace Miller, his maternal great-aunt, a woman whose name was only ever spoken in hushed, incomplete sentences by his grandmother, Evelyn. The resemblance was so jarring, so precise, that it felt less like a coincidence and more like a premonition printed on fading paper. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He leaned closer, his fingers tracing the edge of the brittle photograph. His gaze shifted from the girl's face to the dark slate blackboard behind her. Most of it was covered in neat, looping cursive, likely a catechism or a grammar lesson. But in the bottom right corner, set apart from the rest of the text, was a different script. It was hurried, almost desperate, the chalk strokes of a child trying to convey an adult's terror. The sentence was short, but it landed with the weight of a stone. "Don't wait for me," it read. "They're taking me where the river goes quiet." The phrase echoed in the silent, dusty room, a chillingly poetic message from a ghost. It wasn't a location on a map. It was a destination of finality, a place from which there was no return. A knot of dread tightened in Daniel's stomach, a cold fear that this old secret was somehow tied to his own. To understand the true gravity of that message, to feel the weight of a silence that had stretched over more than a century, one must leave the dusty cottage of 2015 and travel back 30 years. Back to 1985, in that same small town of Beau Reve, Louisiana. It was a place where time seemed to bend and slow, where the air hung heavy and humid, thick with the sweet perfume of magnolia blossoms and the damp, earthy smell of the bayou. Ancient live oaks, draped in veils of Spanish moss, formed canopies over quiet streets lined with shotgun houses and Creole cottages. Their brightly painted shutters, sky blue, faded yellow, deep green, offered the only resistance to the oppressive summer heat. Life moved at the pace of a porch swing, governed by the distant hum of cicadas and the evening chirp of crickets. It was a town of interconnected lives, where secrets were currency and the past was never truly buried. In this town lived the Walker family, their lives a carefully constructed facade of Southern routine and modest stability. The father, Thomas Walker, was a stern, hard-working man who left each morning before sunrise to open his hardware store in the center of town. The mother, Carol, was a devout homemaker whose days were measured by the rhythms of cleaning, cooking, and prayer. Her gumbos and jambalayas were neighborhood legends, but her spirit was wound tight with unspoken anxieties. Living with them was the maternal grandmother, Evelyn Miller, a woman of few words who spent her days in a rocking chair on the screened-in porch, her hands always busy shelling peas or quilting. Her silence was a fortress, guarding the family's deepest history. Their house on Elm Street was a place of contained love, but also of simmering tensions and expectations that hung in the air as thick as the Louisiana humidity. The year is 1912. The place is St. Cecilia's Academy for Young Women, a stark brick institution nestled in the rural quiet of central Louisiana, miles from the nearest town. Life here is governed by the tolling of a single, heavy bell and the rigid tenets of Catholic doctrine. The air within its walls is perpetually cool, carrying the scent of lemon oil used to polish the dark wood floors, and the faint dry smell of chalk dust from the classrooms. Mornings begin before sunrise with a call to prayer, the girls kneeling on cold stone in the chapel, their heads bowed, their thoughts a mixture of piety and daydreams. Their days are a carefully orchestrated sequence of lessons: Latin, theology, literature, and domestic arts. There is no room for spontaneity, no space for the chaotic, untamed emotions of youth. The world outside, with its jazz music just beginning to simmer in New Orleans and its talk of progress, feels 1,000 miles away. Grace Miller existed within this structured world like a ghost. At 17, she possessed a quiet, watchful stillness that set her apart from the other girls. While they chattered in hushed tones during sewing circles or exchanged furtive glances in the dining hall, Grace seemed to be listening to a different frequency. Her uniform, a severe navy blue dress with a starched white collar, always seemed impeccably neat, yet it couldn't contain the profound sorrow in her large, dark eyes. Those eyes, so much like the ones her grandnephew Daniel would one day recognize, looked out at the world as if from behind a pane of glass. She moved through the hallowed halls of St. Cecilia's with a deliberate, almost weightless grace, her presence barely disturbing the thick, silent air of the academy. She was a model student on the surface, obedient and diligent, but her spirit was elsewhere, lost in a place no one else could see. Her family, the Millers, had sent her to St. Cecilia's to secure a respectable future, to mold her into a proper young lady worthy of a good marriage. They were a family of modest means but immense pride, living in a small town where reputation was everything. Sending a daughter to the academy was a sign of aspiration, a sacrifice made to ensure she learned the virtues of discipline and piety. They envisioned her returning home polished and refined, ready to fulfill her duties as a wife and mother. What they did not see, or chose to ignore, was the dreamer in their daughter. They did not know about the small, worn sketchbook she kept hidden beneath her mattress, filled with charcoal drawings of the bayou, of faces from her hometown, of a world brimming with a life and color that St. Cecilia's was designed to suppress. The other young women at the academy were a tapestry of Southern girlhood, woven from threads of privilege, duty, and quiet desperation. There was Beatrice Dubois, the daughter of a wealthy cotton farmer, whose laughter was a little too loud, and whose eyes held a spark of defiance. There was Eleanor Vance, thin and pale, whose fervent piety seemed a desperate attempt to please her stern, unyielding family. And there was Marie Thibodeau, Grace's closest confidant, a kind, round-faced girl from a family of fishermen, who understood silence and knew how to keep secrets. They were all bound together by the shared experience of confinement, their lives dictated by the watchful eyes of the nuns who patrolled the corridors like silent sentinels, their rosary beads clicking softly with each step. Their days unfolded with a monotonous rhythm. Breakfast was a silent affair, the only sounds, the clinking of spoons against porcelain bowls, and a soft murmur of a prayer read by the Mother Superior. Lessons were conducted in classrooms where sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The girls sat at their wooden desks, their postures ramrod straight, their hands folded neatly when not writing. In the afternoons, they practiced needlepoint or learned the proper way to manage a household, skills deemed essential for their future roles. Their world was small, contained within the brick walls of the academy and the sprawling, manicured grounds that were themselves a kind of beautiful prison, enclosed by a tall iron fence. Evenings were the hardest. After a simple supper and evening prayers, the girls were sent to the dormitory, a long room lined with identical iron-framed beds. The lights were extinguished at precisely 9 o'clock, plunging the room into a deep darkness broken only by slivers of moonlight. It was in this forced stillness that the silence became heavy, filled with the unspoken anxieties and longings of 24 young women on the cusp of life. It was here that Grace's melancholy was most palpable. While others whispered secrets or cried softly into their pillows, Grace would lie perfectly still, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling as if she could see through it to the star-dusted Louisiana sky beyond. She was trapped not just by the school but by a secret that was growing inside her. Sister Agnes was the primary guardian of their days. She was a tall, gaunt woman whose face seemed carved from granite, her expression perpetually set in a look of stern disapproval. She taught literature, parsing the works of long-dead poets for moral lessons, while ignoring the passion and pain that gave them life. The girls feared her sharp tongue and her uncanny ability to detect the slightest infraction, from a whispered word to a stray, rebellious thought. Yet, on rare occasions, a flicker of something else would cross her face, a weariness, perhaps, or a shadow of old sorrow, as she looked at the young faces before her. It was a fleeting glimpse of the woman who existed beneath the black habit, a woman who had once been a girl herself, full of dreams that had long since turned to dust. Grace's connection to the world outside the academy had been reduced to carefully censored letters from her mother, filled with news of the town and gentle reminders of her duties. She wrote back, her own letters just as guarded, never mentioning the drawings she made in secret or the crushing weight of her loneliness. She never wrote about the boy, the one with kind eyes and a slow smile, whose memory was both a comfort and a torment. He was the source of her secret, the reason she was here. The memory of his touch, of their clandestine meetings by the quiet stretch of the river back home, was a sin she recited in confession each week, her words a hollow echo in the small, dark booth. The priest would offer absolution, but it brought no peace. The neighborhood surrounding St. Cecilia's was a world away. On quiet afternoons, from the highest window of the dormitory, Grace could see the smoke rising from the chimneys of distant farmhouses. She could hear the faint whistle of a train, a mournful sound that spoke of movement, of escape, of a life continuing on without her. The air outside the gates smelled of damp earth, of pine needles, and of the sweet, cloying scent of honeysuckle that grew wild along the fences. These sensory details were like dispatches from a foreign land, reminders of the freedom she had lost. She would press her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging the pain, and ache with a longing so profound it felt like a physical illness. Her friendship with Marie Thibodeau was her only anchor. Marie was simple and kind, her heart unburdened by the complexities that tormented Grace. They would walk together during the brief, supervised recreation period in the gardens, their conversations a patchwork of hushed observations and shared silences. Marie knew something was wrong, saw the shadows deepening in Grace's eyes, but she did not press. She offered her presence as a quiet comfort, a small, human warmth in the cold, institutional air. It was to Marie that Grace would sometimes show her sketches, a silent sharing of her inner world. Marie would look at the drawings of birds in flight or the churning waters of the bayou and understand, without words, that they were portraits of Grace's own captive soul. As the spring of 1912 deepened, a subtle change came over Grace. A new fragility seemed to cling to her, a transparency that made her look as if she might simply dissolve into the pale afternoon light. She ate less, her already slender frame growing thinner, and a perpetual weariness settled upon her. The other girls noticed, whispering among themselves that she was ill, perhaps with consumption, a common and feared ailment of the time. The nuns watched her with a sharp, clinical gaze, their concern less for her well-being than for the potential disruption to the academy's orderly existence. The secret she carried was becoming a physical burden, a weight that bent her shoulders and stole the breath from her lungs. The Millers, in their infrequent letters, remained oblivious. Her mother wrote of preparing the house for her return at the end of the term, of the new dress she was sewing for her, of the eligible young men in town who had been asking after her. Each word was a small, sharp stab, a reminder of the life that was no longer possible, of the daughter they believed they had. Grace would read these letters in the privacy of her small bed, the paper trembling in her hands, and feel the chasm between their expectations and her reality widen into an impassable gulf. The shame was a constant, bitter taste in her mouth, a poison that seeped into every corner of her being. In the classroom, her focus wavered. She would stare at the blackboard, at the neat cursive of Sister Agnes's lessons, but the words would blur into meaningless shapes. Her mind was adrift, caught in a terrifying loop of fear and regret. What would happen when they found out? The question was a drumbeat in her head, a rhythm of pure dread. She knew the consequences of such a scandal. She would be a disgrace to her family, an outcast. Her future, once a path laid out with certainty, had become a dark, unknowable void. The academy, once a prison, was now the only thing standing between her and a far more terrifying fate. The other girls, wrapped up in their own small dramas, began to distance themselves from her. Her profound, unnerving sadness was like a contagion, they instinctively sought to avoid. She became an island of sorrow in the midst of their youthful society. Only Marie remained, her loyalty a silent, unwavering presence. She would leave a piece of sweet bread for Grace on her bedside table, or press a wildflower into her hand during their walks, small gestures of a love that asked for nothing in return. It was this simple, unassuming kindness that kept Grace from shattering completely, that gave her the strength to endure one more day, one more silent meal, one more starless night. And so, the days leading up to the class photograph were heavy with this unspoken tension. The air grew thick and humid as Louisiana marched towards summer, the atmosphere inside the academy becoming as oppressive as the weather outside. A visiting photographer was scheduled to come, an annual tradition to document the graduating class and provide a memento for the families. For most of the girls, it was a moment of mild excitement, a break in the routine. For Grace Miller, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like a final statement, a last chance to be seen before she disappeared. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that her time at St. Cecilia's was coming to an end, one way or another. The day the photograph was taken arrived with an air of manufactured importance. It was a Tuesday in late May, the Louisiana sun already asserting its dominance, promising a humid, sweltering afternoon. A notice had been posted for a week. Mr. Alistair Finch, a photographer from Baton Rouge, would be arriving to take the annual class portrait. For most of the girls, this was a welcome disruption, a brief departure from the liturgical rhythm of their lives. There was a low hum of excitement during breakfast, a rustle of starched collars and straightened seams. The nuns patrolled the dormitories with extra vigilance, inspecting hairstyles and ensuring every uniform was immaculate. They were not just girls, they were ambassadors of St. Cecilia's, and their image had to be one of piety, discipline, and serene obedience. The photograph was not for them. It was for the Academy's reputation, and for the families who paid for this molding of character. For Grace Miller, the news landed not with excitement, but with a cold, hollow finality. The photograph felt less like a memento and more like an epitaph, a final, formal record of the girl she was before she ceased to exist in any recognizable way. That morning, her reflection in the wavy dormitory mirror seemed alien to her, the face of a stranger haunted by a secret too large for her slender frame. The usual weariness in her eyes had deepened into a raw, profound sorrow that no amount of sleep could erase. She moved through the morning's preparations in a fog, her hands performing the familiar tasks of dressing and prayer with a mechanical detachment. While other girls pinched their cheeks for a touch of color, Grace felt the blood draining from hers, leaving a pale, almost translucent mask. She was already becoming a ghost. Mr. Alistair Finch arrived in a dusty Ford Model T, a man who seemed to belong to a different, more vibrant world. He was stout and wore a tweed vest. Despite the heat, his mustache waxed into two perfect curls. He smelled of tobacco and the sharp, chemical scent of his trade, an aroma that cut through the Academy's smells of lemon oil and old wood. He set up his large, intimidating box camera on a heavy wooden tripod in the main courtyard, its brass lens gleaming in the sun. The girls, herded out by Sister Agnes, watched him with a mixture of awe and fear. He worked with a focused, unhurried confidence, draping a black cloth over his head and peering through the lens, treating them less as individuals and more as elements in a composition. His presence felt like an intrusion, a foreign body in the closed circulatory system of St. Cecilia's. The staging began under the imperious direction of Sister Agnes. She arranged the 24 girls on a set of tiered wooden risers, positioning them with sharp, quick movements of her hands. You, Beatrice, in the back. Eleanor, chin up. Grace, second row, here. Grace found herself wedged between Beatrice Dubois, whose restless energy was barely contained, and the ever-seraphic Eleanor Vance. The sun was hot on their faces, forcing them to squint. The air was thick with the scent of cut grass and the sweet perfume of the nearby magnolia trees. It was a scene of perfect Southern propriety, a portrait of disciplined young womanhood. Yet, beneath the surface, a current of unspoken anxieties ran through the group. For a fleeting moment, Grace felt Marie Thibodeau's hand give her a slight, reassuring squeeze before they were ordered into their final positions. Just as Mr. Finch prepared to take the shot, a flash of brilliant color darted into view. An indigo bunting, its feathers a shocking iridescent blue, landed on a low-hanging branch of a live oak, singing a short, sharp melody. In an instant, the carefully constructed tableau was broken. A dozen heads turned, their solemn expressions replaced by momentary wonder. The sight of such untamed, natural beauty was a startling contrast to their own constrained lives. Sister Agnes's reaction was immediate. She clapped her hands together once, a sound like a pistol shot that echoed across the courtyard. "Ladies, your attention now." The girls snapped their heads back toward the camera, their faces now subtly altered, a hint of strain and resentment clouding their feigned composure. Grace, however, had not moved. Her gaze was already fixed on a point far beyond the bird, beyond the academy walls. "The light in the courtyard was too harsh, too direct," Mr. Finch declared after peering through his lens. "It created unflattering shadows." He suggested moving indoors, to one of the classrooms, where the light would be softer, more controlled. A collective sigh of relief went through the girls as they were ushered out of the heat and into the cool, familiar confines of Sister Agnes's main classroom. The risers were quickly reassembled in front of the large slate blackboard, which was still covered in the morning's elegant cursive. The move shifted the atmosphere entirely. The formal, educational setting added a new layer of solemnity to the occasion, stripping away the brief, rebellious joy the bird had brought. Here, they were students again, subjects under the watchful eye of both the camera and the church. This change of location, this small moment of logistical chaos, provided an unforeseen opportunity. While Mr. Finch adjusted his camera for the indoor light, and Sister Agnes was momentarily called to the classroom door by a junior nun, the strict order dissolved. The girls shifted on the risers, whispering and fanning their faces with their hands. For Grace, it was as if time had suddenly slowed down, offering her a single, terrifying chance. The small, half-inch piece of chalk she had found on the floor earlier, and impulsively tucked into the cuff of her sleeve, suddenly felt like a burning coal in her palm. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. This was it. This was the only way to leave a message, a final, desperate cry into the void. Shielded by the girl in front of her and the general commotion, Grace leaned back slightly, her movements small and deliberate. Her hand, shaking uncontrollably, darted out toward the blackboard. She pressed the chalk to the slate in the bottom right-hand corner, a space partially hidden from most sight lines. The words came out in a hurried, jagged scrawl, a child's panicked script so unlike the perfect penmanship drilled into her. "Don't wait for me," she wrote. "They're taking me where the river goes quiet." It was a coded farewell meant only for Marie, a reference to a grim local folk tale they both knew, a story about a place from which no one ever returned. It was an admission of defeat, a warning, and a goodbye, all compressed into one frantic sentence. She pulled her hand away just as Sister Agnes turned back, her sharp gaze sweeping over the girls to restore order. "Silence! Eyes forward!" she commanded. Mr. Finch, now ready, ducked under his black cloth. "Hold perfectly still, young ladies. Look right here." Grace lifted her chin, her face a mask of pale composure. But her eyes, those large, dark pools of sorrow, could not lie. They held the raw, immediate grief of her secret act, the terror of what was to come. There was a brilliant, silent flash of light as the magnesium powder ignited, followed by a soft poof and a cloud of acrid white smoke. The moment was captured. The image was frozen, and in the corner of the frame, unseen by anyone, her desperate message waited silently in the dark. The spell was broken. The girls blinked away the bright spots in their vision, a nervous chatter erupting as they were finally allowed to stand and stretch. Mr. Finch, satisfied with his work, began to carefully pack his plates and equipment, oblivious to the fact that he had not just taken a photograph, but had documented the final silent scream of a girl about to be erased. As Grace filed out of the classroom with the others, she felt strangely light, hollowed out. The fine white chalk dust on the tips of her fingers felt like the residue of a ghost. The portrait was meant to be a testament to the Academy's success, a proud memento for her family. But Grace knew what it really was. It was the last page of her story, written in chalk and sealed by a flash of light. The days that followed the photograph were a suffocating blur of routine and dread. For Grace Miller, the world had been stripped of its color, leaving only shades of gray. The tolling of the Academy bell, once a simple marker of time, now sounded like a funeral dirge, each chime bringing her closer to an unknown end. She moved through the halls of St. Cecilia's like a sleepwalker, her eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the curious glances of the other girls and the sharp, knowing gaze of Sister Agnes. Her secret was no longer just a weight in her soul. It was a physical presence, a cold knot in her stomach that stole her appetite and her breath. She stopped speaking almost entirely, even to Marie, whose worried face was a painful reminder of the goodbye she had already written in chalk. The waiting was the worst part, a silent, agonizing vigil for a verdict that had already been decided. The summons came not with a shout, but with a quiet, rustling piece of paper. A letter, bearing her father's severe, angular script, had arrived for the Mother Superior. A junior nun found Grace in the garden, where she was staring blankly at the stone bench where she and Marie used to talk. The nun's voice was devoid of emotion as she relayed the order. "The Mother Superior wishes to see you in her office, now." The walk through the cool, silent corridors felt like the final mile. The office was a sparse, intimidating room, smelling of old paper and beeswax. The Mother Superior sat behind a large oak desk, her face impassive, while Sister Agnes stood by the window, a dark silhouette against the afternoon light. There was no pretense of concern, no offer of comfort. This was not a pastoral visit. It was an administrative procedure, cold and final. They did not use the word that had been haunting Grace's every waking moment. The Mother Superior, her voice as dry as autumn leaves, spoke of a delicate family matter and a decline in health. It was decided, she explained, that it would be best for Grace to complete her convalescence at home. The lie was laid out on the polished desk between them, a carefully constructed fiction designed to protect the Academy's reputation and the Miller family's honor. Grace sat perfectly still in the hard wooden chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. She said nothing. What was there to say? Her silence was taken as agreement, her vacant stare as acquiescence. She was a problem being solved, a stain being quietly removed before it could set. The decision had been made far away in her father's study, and there was no appeal. Her departure was arranged with the sterile efficiency of an exorcism. It took place before dawn 2 days later, while the rest of the academy was shrouded in sleep and darkness. A single lamp burned in the entryway as Sister Agnes led her down the main staircase, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty hall. Grace carried nothing with her. The few belongings she had, including her hidden sketchbook, had been left behind, deemed unnecessary. Outside the imposing iron gates, a plain, dark carriage waited, its horse steaming in the cool morning air. There were no farewells, no last looks. As she was ushered into the carriage by a grim-faced woman she didn't know, she glanced back at the dormitory window, hoping for a final glimpse of Marie. But there was only darkness. The carriage door shut with a heavy, definitive thud, sealing her away from the only world she had known. Later that morning, at the daily assembly, the Mother Superior addressed the student body. Her tone was solemn, laced with a practiced sadness. She announced that their classmate, Grace Miller, had been called home suddenly. She had been diagnosed with a severe case of consumption, and her family wished for her to be in their care during her final days. A wave of hushed gasps and murmurs rippled through the chapel. In the back row, Marie Thibodeau felt the blood drain from her face. She knew, with the certainty that made her physically ill, that it was a lie. The words from the blackboard burned in her memory. "They're taking me where the river goes quiet." This wasn't a story of illness. It was a story of erasure. While the other girls bowed their heads in prayer for Grace's soul, Marie stared straight ahead, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Back in Grace's small hometown, the Miller family began the painful, meticulous work of cementing the lie. Her mother, her face etched with a grief made heavier by shame, received neighbors on the porch, her voice trembling as she recounted the tragic news from the academy. She spoke of Grace's persistent cough, of her growing weakness, details invented to lend credibility to the diagnosis. Mr. Miller, a man broken by a pride that had forced him into this monstrous deception, retreated into his work, his silence a wall that no one dared to breach. The town of Beaurêve, a community bound by shared histories and a deep respect for propriety, accepted the story without question. Tuberculosis was a familiar tragedy, a respectable way for a young life to be extinguished. It was a sorrow they could understand and share, unlike the unspeakable truth. The community's response was one of genuine, if misdirected, sympathy. Casseroles were left on the Miller's doorstep. The local priest spoke of Grace's piety from the pulpit, holding her up as an example of fragile, fleeting beauty. The whispers were of sorrow, not scandal. In the midst of this performance, Grace's younger sister, Evelyn, a girl of only 10, watched and learned a terrible lesson. She saw the way her parents' eyes would become vacant when Grace's name was mentioned, the way they would change the subject with a brittle finality. She was told simply that her sister was very sick and had gone away to a special hospital. She was instructed never to ask questions, to accept the story as it was told. The weight of this enforced silence settled onto her young shoulders, a burden she would carry for the rest of her life. Meanwhile, Grace's journey continued. The carriage rattled on for 2 days, moving steadily south and west, deeper into the marshy, untamed heart of Louisiana. The landscape outside her window transformed from rolling fields and familiar towns into a dense, oppressive wilderness of cypress swamps and dark, slow-moving water. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling of decay and damp earth. There were no towns here, only isolated shacks and the occasional fishing boat gliding silently through the bayous. Grace knew where she was going. The phrase from her message wasn't just a folktale. It was a real place, a stretch of the Atchafalaya River, so remote and still that it seemed the world ended there. She was being taken to the place where secrets were sent to die, far from the judgment of prying eyes. The destination was not a hospital or a sanatorium. It was a grim, isolated institution known only as the Sacred Heart Home for Wayward Women. The building was a stark, 2-story wooden structure, its paint peeling, surrounded by a high fence and the silent, watchful cypress trees. It stood on a desolate piece of land where the river ran deep and quiet. Here, a handful of nuns oversaw a small population of forgotten women, girls who, like Grace, had brought shame upon their families. Life inside was a regimen of prayer, hard labor, and absolute silence. Their pasts were erased, their futures non-existent. Upon her arrival, Grace Miller ceased to exist. She was given a new plain name and a gray, shapeless uniform. She had been successfully disappeared. Back at St. Cecilia's, the void Grace left was slowly filled in. Her name was removed from the student roster. Her bed in the dormitory was assigned to a new girl. Only for Marie Thibodeau did the ghost of Grace remain. Weeks later, when the class photographs arrived from Mr. Finch, Marie's hands trembled as she looked at the image. There was Grace, in the second row, her eyes holding a universe of sorrow. And there, in the corner of the frame, faint but undeniable, were the words she had scrawled on the blackboard. Marie hid the photograph at the bottom of her trunk, a secret testament to a friendship and a truth that she could never share. The photograph was a beautiful lie, but the words in the corner were the horrifying, permanent truth. A few months later, in the late autumn of 1912, the final act of the deception was carried out. The Miller family placed a small, simple death notice in the local newspaper. It stated that Grace Miller, beloved daughter and sister, had succumbed to her long illness and passed away peacefully. A memorial service was held at the family's church, a somber affair with a closed casket, for there was no body to bury. The town mourned the loss of a promising young woman, cut down in her prime. The story of Grace Miller, the bright student who died of consumption, became a fixed point in the town's collective memory, a sad but uncomplicated tragedy. The lie was now complete, sealed by prayer and public grief. For Evelyn Miller, the silence surrounding her sister became the defining feature of her childhood. She learned to navigate the hollow spaces in her family's life, the conversations that stopped abruptly, the old photograph that was never displayed. The secret became a part of her, a deep, internal knowledge that love and family honor were built upon a foundation of what must never be said. This fear of truth, this instinct for concealment, became ingrained in her character. It was a trauma she didn't have the words for, a quiet poison that she would carry with her into adulthood, into her own marriage, and into the family she would one day raise. The silence was a legacy, passed down as surely as her mother's quilting patterns or her father's stern gaze. In the Miller house, all physical traces of Grace were methodically erased. Her clothes were bundled up and given to a charity for the poor in another town. Her books, her school papers, the few girlish trinkets she owned, all were quietly disposed of, as if they might betray the family secret. But her mother could not bring herself to part with everything. In the dead of night, she took a small tin box and placed inside it the few things that remained, a single lock of Grace's dark hair, the rosary from her first communion, and the class photograph from St. Cecilia's. She hid the box in the false bottom of a heavy cedar chest, a secret tomb for a daughter who was not dead, a hidden shrine to a ghost who was still breathing somewhere out in the world. Over the years, the lie hardened into history. The story of Grace's tragic death was told to new generations, a cautionary tale about the fragility of life. The truth of her pregnancy, her exile, and her erasure was buried beneath decades of determined silence. No one from St. Cecilia's ever spoke of it again. Marie Thibodeau married, raised a family, and took the secret of the blackboard message to her grave. The Miller family rebuilt their lives around the hollow space Grace had left, their silence becoming a fortress that protected them from shame, but also imprisoned them in a state of perpetual, unspoken grief. The real tragedy was not Grace's fate, but the silence that swallowed her whole, a quiet, suffocating force that would ripple outward, touching lives far into the future. The first few years after Clara's disappearance were a slow, agonizing descent into a new kind of normal. The vibrant, hopeful panic of the initial searches curdled into a permanent, low-grade ache. The flyers stapled to telephone poles, bearing Clara's high school portrait, were bleached by the Louisiana sun, their ink running in the humid rain until her smiling face dissolved into a ghostly blur. The phone calls from concerned neighbors tapered off, replaced by averted gazes in the grocery store. The community's casseroles stopped arriving. Inside the Walker house on Elm Street, time seemed to coagulate. Carol Walker developed a ritual of waiting by the front window, her hope a stubborn, flickering flame against the wind of passing days. Thomas Walker retreated into the stoic silence of his hardware store, his grief a locked room no one was allowed to enter. The house, once filled with the scent of turpentine and the sound of Clara's music, became a quiet, suffocating monument to her absence. Clara's bedroom became a forbidden sanctuary, a sealed pocket of time. Carol kept the door shut, not out of denial, but out of a desperate need to preserve what was left. A thin, uniform layer of dust settled over everything, a delicate gray shroud on the spines of her art history books, the surface of her turntable, and the collection of smooth stones on her windowsill. The sharp, chemical smell of her oil paints slowly faded, replaced by the dry, musty scent of old paper and undisturbed air. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Carol would stand outside the closed door, her hand hovering over the knob, listening to the profound silence within. She never went inside. To enter would be to confirm the finality of the emptiness, to admit that the girl who inhabited that space was truly gone. The room was a tomb, and she was its unwilling, heartbroken guardian. Her birthdays arrived and passed like ghosts. On what would have been her 20th, Carol baked Clara's favorite chocolate cake, a single, unlit candle pressed into its center. The family sat at the dinner table in silence, the empty chair, a gaping wound between them. They did not speak her name. They did not eat the cake. The following year, there was no cake, only a heavier silence. By her 25th birthday, the day was marked only by Carol's retreat into her bedroom, the door closed, and Thomas's longer-than-usual hours at the store. For Daniel, these anniversaries were the hardest. They were invisible holidays of grief, days saturated with an unspoken tension that made the air in the house feel thin and hard to breathe. The milestones of a life that should have been college graduation, a first job, perhaps a wedding, became a calendar of phantom pains for the Walker family. Daniel grew up in the long shadow of his sister's absence. The boisterous, idolizing 12-year-old boy was slowly chiseled away, replaced by a quiet, observant young man who learned to navigate the emotional minefield of his home. He learned that the mention of Clara's name was a trigger for his mother's weeping or his father's cold, impenetrable anger. He stopped asking questions. His friends' casual talk of their own siblings felt like a foreign language. To escape the suffocating quiet of his house, he found refuge in the world of lines, angles, and solid structures. He drew blueprints, obsessing over the logic and order of buildings. His choice to become an architect was an unconscious reaction to the formless, chaotic nature of his family's grief. He sought to build things that would stand, that would last, in a life defined by something that had been so easily taken away. The world outside the Walkers' front door moved on. Beau Rêve, Louisiana, slowly changed, its edges softening with time. The old Boudreau family sold their bakery, which became a chain coffee shop with bright, impersonal lighting. New families with young children moved into the houses on Elm Street, their laughter and backyard barbecues, a stark contrast to the stillness emanating from the Walkers' home. The story of the missing Walker girl faded from active memory into local folklore, a sad tale told by older residents to newcomers. Thomas's hardware store, once a town hub, began to struggle against the new, sprawling big-box stores that opened on the highway. The town aged, but the Walker family remained frozen in 1985, their grief a private island in the stream of a community that had, out of necessity and the simple passage of time, forgotten how to mourn with them. Over the decades, Carol Walker seemed to physically shrink, her posture bending under the invisible weight of her sorrow. Her world contracted until it consisted only of the house, the small garden out back, and the Sunday service at St. Anne's. Her conversations became looping, mournful refrains that always circled back to an unspoken center. She would talk about the weather, the parish news, but her eyes would be distant, lost in a memory. She developed habits born of a hope she refused to extinguish. Every single night for 30 years, she left the porch light on, a small, golden beacon in the darkness. It was a quiet, desperate signal, a message to a ghost. If you ever come back, you will find your way home. Her waiting was no longer an active state of expectation, but a permanent condition of her soul, as much a part of her as her own heartbeat. Thomas Walker's silence hardened with age, becoming a brittle, unbreachable wall. He met his family's pain not with comfort, but with a rigid, almost resentful stoicism. He worked from sunup to sundown, his hands always rough with the dust of cement or the grease of machinery, as if he could physically exhaust the grief from his body. He never allowed Clara's name to be spoken in his presence. His refusal was a form of erasure, a desperate attempt to control a narrative that had spiraled out of his hands. Then, in the fall of 2010, his heart gave out while he was unloading a shipment of lumber. He died as he had lived for the past 25 years, silently, with his pain locked away. His death left a new kind of void in the house, stripping away the anger and leaving only the pure, undiluted sorrow of Carol and Daniel. Throughout it all, the grandmother, Evelyn Miller, sat in her rocking chair on the porch, a silent, knowing oracle. Her hands were never still, always busy with her quilting, pulling a needle and thread through colorful patches of fabric. Her silence was different from her son-in-law's. It was not born of denial, but of a deep, ancient history. She had seen this pattern before. She had lived through the disappearance of her own sister, Grace, and had been forced to carry that secret for a lifetime. As she watched her daughter Carol wither and her grandson Daniel grow up in a house of ghosts, she saw the tragic echo of her own past. Her silence was the heavy, protective blanket of a secret she believed would destroy them all if revealed. She quilted their broken lives together, her stitches a prayer that the past would remain buried. The house became a museum of absence, where everyday objects were imbued with a powerful, painful significance. In the back of a kitchen cabinet, Clara's favorite coffee mug, chipped at the rim, sat untouched. On the mantelpiece, a framed photograph of a teenage Clara, her arms slung around a grinning young Daniel, gathered dust. Her old raincoat still hung on a hook by the back door, as if she might return on a rainy afternoon and shrug it on. These were not just things. They were anchors to a life that had stopped abruptly. They were physical manifestations of a ghost, their presence a constant, throbbing reminder of the emptiness she had left behind. For Daniel, touching these objects felt like touching a live wire of memory, a jolt of a past that was simultaneously a lifetime ago and only yesterday. And so, 30 years drifted by, layering the Walker family's story with the fine dust of time. It is now 2015. The raw, gaping wound of 1985 has long since scarred over, but the ache beneath the surface has never subsided. The porch light on Elm Street still burns. Carol moves through her quiet days, a wraith in her own home. Daniel, now a man of 42, carries the weight of being the child who stayed. And Evelyn Miller, the silent keeper of the family's deepest secrets, has finally passed away at the age of 94. Her death is the catalyst, the event that will force Daniel to sift through the artifacts of a life defined by silence. In his grandmother's house, in a dusty cedar chest, a rusted tin box waits. The time for secrets is over. The silence is about to break. The photograph, for all its ghostly power, was still a fragile, dying object. As an architect who spent his life coaxing stories from decaying structures, Daniel Walker understood that its secrets were fading with every passing year. The cracks spiderwebbing across its surface were not just physical damage, they were fractures in the narrative, obscuring details that might be vital. Driven by a need for clarity, a professional and deeply personal hunger to see what was truly there, he decided to have it restored. He found a specialist in New Orleans, a quiet woman named Dr. Elaine Benoit, who worked out of a small, climate-controlled studio in the French Quarter. She handled the sepia-toned artifact with the reverence of a surgeon, explaining how high-resolution scanning and digital restoration could heal the wounds of time, pulling a clearer, more stable truth from the brittle paper without harming the original. He left the tin box and its contents in her care, feeling a strange mix of hope and dread. The process took 2 weeks. Dr. Benoit worked methodically, first creating a digital scan of such immense resolution that it captured the very texture of the paper fibers. Then, on her screen, she began the patient work of digital archaeology. She gently stitched the cracks back together, pixel by pixel, removing the stains and water spots that had bloomed over a century. She adjusted the contrast, pulling details from the deep shadows and softening the overexposed glare from the classroom windows. It was a slow, meticulous resurrection. When Daniel returned, she showed him the result on a large monitor. The image was transformed. It was no longer a hazy, dreamlike relic. The faces of the girls were sharp, their individual expressions of boredom, piety, or nervousness now startlingly clear. The room had depth and texture, and the message on the blackboard, Grace's desperate scrawl, was now rendered with chilling, undeniable clarity. Seeing it so vividly was like hearing a voice from the grave. The image pulsed with a new and immediate sorrow. Daniel stared at the face of his great-aunt, Grace Miller, her features no longer softened by age and decay. The melancholy in her eyes was not a vague sadness. It was a raw, active terror, a look he now recognized with a sickening lurch in his stomach. It was the look of an animal caught in a trap. He could almost feel the oppressive heat of the room, smell the chalk dust, hear the strained silence before the camera's flash. The restored photograph didn't just preserve a moment. It amplified it, turning a faded historical artifact into a present-tense tragedy. The words, "Don't wait for me. They're taking me where the river goes quiet," were no longer a poetic whisper from the past. They were a shout, and Daniel felt he was finally hearing it for the first time. Back in the quiet of his own home, Daniel spent hours with the digital file, his face illuminated by the glow of his computer screen. He zoomed in, exploring the world that had been locked away in that photograph. He examined the faces of the other girls, searching for any sign of complicity or sympathy. He saw Beatrice Dubois' barely concealed smirk, Eleanor Vance's anxious piety, and Marie Thibodeau, in the back row, her eyes fixed on Grace with an expression of profound, helpless worry. He studied the details of the classroom, the crucifix on the wall, the neat stack of textbooks on a shelf, the wood grain of the floorboards. He was searching for context, for any small detail that might explain the full story of that day. He felt like he was walking through a memory that wasn't his own, a silent witness to a crime whose nature he was only just beginning to understand. His gaze kept drifting away from the central figures, drawn to the periphery of the frame. The tall, arched windows on the left side of the classroom had been a source of glare in the original photo, a bright, washed-out blur. In Dr. Benoit's restored version, the light was controlled, and the glass, though wavy and imperfect as old glass is, now held a faint, distorted reflection. At first, it was just a confusing smear of light and shadow, a meaningless abstraction. But Daniel, a man trained to read the subtle language of light and structure, leaned closer. He used the software to isolate that section of the image, increasing the contrast, sharpening the edges, trying to force the ghost in the glass to give up its secret. The shape was indistinct, but it was undeniably human. It was someone or something that had been standing just out of the camera's direct view. He worked for nearly an hour, patiently manipulating the image, feeling his heart begin to beat a little faster. Slowly, the distorted shapes resolved into something recognizable. It was not one figure, but two, reflected in the pane of the classroom window. They were standing near the doorway, behind the photographer. One was clearly a nun, her wimple and dark habit creating a familiar, sharp silhouette. She had her back to the window, facing into the room. But it was the second figure that made the air in Daniel's study grow cold. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark, formal suit and a hat. He was not a priest. He was not the photographer. He was an outsider, a figure of severe secular authority. He stood with a rigid posture, his hands clasped behind his back, observing the scene with an unnerving stillness. A wave of nausea washed over Daniel. He zoomed out to see the entire scene again, the girls arranged on the risers, the stern-faced Sister Agnes at the side, and now the two silent observers reflected in the window. He looked at Grace's face, at the raw terror in her eyes, and then back at the reflection of the man at the door. And in that moment, 100 years of silence shattered. The timeline collapsed. The words on the blackboard, "They're taking me," were not a premonition of a future event. It was a real-time report. The man in the suit wasn't there to enroll a daughter or discuss a donation. He was an escort, an enforcer. He was there for Grace. The photograph hadn't captured a moment before the tragedy. It had captured the tragedy as it was unfolding. The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Grace's family hadn't just made a quiet, shameful decision to send her away in the dead of night. They had arranged for her to be formally, officially removed, like a prisoner being transferred. They had sent a man in a suit to a Catholic girls' academy to collect their disgraced daughter in the middle of the day. The cold, institutional cruelty of it was breathtaking. This wasn't a panicked, emotional act of a shamed family. It was a calculated, logistical procedure. The shame was so immense that they had outsourced the removal, turning a family matter into a sterile transaction. The photograph was the receipt. It was the evidence of a soul being clinically and efficiently erased from existence in broad daylight. Daniel leaned back in his chair, the screen's glow casting long shadows across his face. The story of Grace was no longer a distant, sad family legend. It was a blueprint, a pattern of behavior. The capacity for such cold, definitive erasure had been there in his family's bloodline all along. He thought of his grandmother Evelyn, who had witnessed this as a child, and whose lifelong silence was not just about protecting a sister's secret, but about burying the knowledge of her own family's brutality. And then, with a dread that felt like ice water flooding his veins, he thought of his own sister, Clara. He thought of his stern, uncommunicative father, a man who met any challenge to his authority with a wall of silent, implacable judgment. The two stories, separated by 73 years, suddenly snapped together. The mystery of Clara's disappearance was no longer a formless void of possibilities. An abduction, a runaway, an accident. It now had a terrifying precedent. The photograph in his hands was not just about Grace Miller. It was a testament to a dark family tradition, a quiet, ruthless method for dealing with inconvenient women. The silence that had defined his life was not a passive consequence of grief. It was an active, inherited weapon. He looked at the image on the screen, at the ghost in the window and the terror in the young girl's eyes, and he understood. He wasn't just looking at the past. He was looking at the reason for his own family's ruin. Daniel did not move from his chair for a long time, the glow of the monitor illuminating the profound stillness that had fallen over him. The revelation was not a sudden explosion of truth, but a slow, cold tide rising in the room, threatening to drown him. The two stories, Grace's and Clara's, were no longer parallel tragedies. They were a single, unbroken narrative of fear, shame, and silent, brutal efficiency. He finally understood his father's impenetrable anger, his grandmother's suffocating silence. It wasn't just the weight of grief they carried. It was the weight of complicity. Thomas Walker, a man of rigid principles and quiet judgment, had not simply lost a daughter. He had created the conditions for her to flee. The family's honor, that fragile Southern construct, had been a weapon, and Clara, like Grace before her, had chosen to escape the blade rather than be cut down by it. The silence wasn't an absence of noise. It was the sound of a cage door swinging shut. There would be no grand confrontation, no moment of catharsis. The people who had built the cage, his stern father, his secretive grandmother, were gone, their truths buried with them. The only person left to tell was his mother, Carol, a woman who had spent 30 years tending to a single false hope. He drove to the old house on Elm Street the next afternoon, the high-resolution print of the 1912 photograph lying face down on the passenger seat like a verdict. The familiar streets of Beau Rêve, with their drooping live oaks and humid air, felt different, haunted now by a history he could see with perfect, painful clarity. He was not driving home to offer closure. He was driving home to perform a final, necessary act of cruelty, to replace the ghost of a missing girl with the ghost of a family that had devoured its own. The weight of this truth felt heavier than 30 years of not knowing. He found Carol on the screened-in porch, rocking slowly in the same chair where Evelyn had spent decades quilting their family's secrets into silence. The air hummed with the lazy drone of a cicada and the rhythmic creak of the chair. He didn't show her the picture at first. He simply sat, and in a low, steady voice, he told her the story of Grace Miller. He described the academy, the secret pregnancy, and the desperate message on the blackboard. Then, he described the reflection in the window, the nun and the tall man in the suit, the cold, official nature of the removal. As he spoke, he watched a lifetime of curated sorrow unravel on his mother's face. She did not gasp or cry out. A quiet, terrible understanding dawned in her eyes, the recognition of a pattern she had felt her entire life but had never been allowed to name. The truth, when it finally arrived, was as quiet and devastating as the silence it replaced. The revelation did not heal Carol Walker. It broke her in a new, more profound way. For 30 years, her grief had a clear shape, a daughter taken by the cruel randomness of the world. Now, that narrative was gone, replaced by the unbearable knowledge that Clara had run not from a stranger, but from them. The porch light she had left on every night was not a beacon of hope, but a symbol of the very judgment her daughter had fled. Her body seemed to shrink further into the rocking chair, her hands falling limp in her lap. After a long silence, she looked at the old family photo album on the wicker table beside her, its cover worn from decades of her mournful touch. With a slow, deliberate movement, she reached out and closed it. The soft thud of the cover was a sound of absolute finality. There were no more stories to tell, no more pages to turn. A week later, Daniel drove to the St. Anne's Cemetery, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and gardenias. He walked past his father's grave without stopping and continued to a small, unmarked plot of land beside his grandmother's headstone. It was a space the family had always kept, an unspoken reservation for a body they never expected to find. He knelt in the soft grass, the 1912 photograph of Grace's class held tight in his hand. He looked at her terrified eyes one last time, a silent acknowledgement of their shared history. He did not erect a stone or say a prayer. Instead, he placed the photograph face down upon the soil, a final, symbolic burial. He was not interring a person, but a secret. He stood, brushed the dirt from his knees, and walked away without looking back, his face a mask of quiet, weary resignation. The heavy silence of his life finally filled, not with peace, but with the unbearable weight of the truth.